my pleasure to welcome Sam Thorogood to the stage to give this talk. Thank you, Sam.
Hello. Some of you may recognize Grog. He's very cute. He'll come back later. So the talk title is kind of interesting and long, and we're just going to talk through a bunch of different ideas. Who am I? I'm fun employed right now. I'm a senior consultant. I give people advice. It's lovely being a consultant. You can give them advice and not care that much if they take it or not, which is kind of an interesting position to be in. My talks now tend to be things that I wish I knew when I was younger. So that's kind of the framing of this talk. Like, you know, this is the way of the world, right? You do things, you learn, you get better. You wish you could tell your younger self this. So instead of that, I'm telling all of you these things that I know now. You can find me online at a bunch of things under Sam Thor. So let's say you want to build a service. This service takes in videos from your users, and because your phones are terrible things that have huge cameras, these videos are too big. We want to make them smaller. This is a cloud service, something we want to put on the internet. So I want to set the scene, right? You're a new developer or even a senior developer who wants to think about how to solve this problem. And you have this idea, and you have this kind of goal at the end. You want to serve the product to users, and like, what is in the middle? Like, what is how do you solve this? And so, you're trying to, as I said, it's a thing that runs on the web, so it probably should run on HTTP and sort of standard web technologies. And you'd think maybe the cloud is going to solve your problem here. And I've been told I actually need to explain why there's dragons here, because apparently this is me being really old and saying dragons on the path is still a concept I need to explain to people. When there's dragons, that's very bad. They may eat you. And so, you try to learn best practice, right? You do some Googling, you search for the cloud providers, you see what they suggest. And we find Amazon, for instance, and this is what you find. You find this weird diagram of like, oh, this is a service that deploys videos to the internet, and it's got a bunch of blocks and components. And OK, I could kind of get my head around that, except I lied. It's actually bigger than that. And you can't really tell. It looks like a maze. And if you're a novice developer and you look at this and you're like, what am I getting into? What is this stuff, right? Like, I have no idea what any of these pieces mean. Let's zoom out. Oh, no, that's too far. And so this is the actual diagram. I didn't cut it up this time, I promise. And this is, the top hit. I mean, to be fair, I've given you a very niche kind of goal, and it is one of Amazon's guides, right? How do I build a video serving website that, not even the website, literally a process that makes videos smaller and puts them onto storage. And this is 6,000 lines of configuration. And all you're ever going to do as a novice developer or a new person, even a senior developer learning about Amazon, is run this blindly. You cannot process that amount of information. And so it's got a really terrible abstraction here. All the things here, and I want to give you some example, is kind of something we refer to collectively as serverless. All these building blocks are trying to avoid running a real computer that just does some work. Now, I don't want to, this is not an A or B option here. I'm not saying this is terrible, you should not use any of it. But I'm going to talk through some of the examples of why this is kind of maybe not what you should be doing. And, it's kind of implied, right? But this is how this whole thing makes me feel, right? This is just such a mess to get your head around. There's something Amazon will maybe if it was someone from Amazon here, they might say, oh, but Sam, it needs to be cloud ready. And I'm like, maybe you're right, but let's think about the complexity first. So what is the alternative, right? I want to be clear, this is not a talk on like how to design an efficient service backend for some video sharing website. But like for me, if I was to describe this to users, this is how I draw it. I draw it with a couple of boxes. The user wants to upload a video. It's got some server that processes that video. Maybe you even have a background task that, over the next few hours converts videos, because that might take a long time. You put it in storage, and you give it back to your users. This is a pretty tractable diagram. I think everyone would probably agree. Hopefully, yes. Great. Good, we're on the same page. And the problem is with all this stuff is that, we have this term called the well-lit path. And so I used to be in a team at Google called developer relations. And well-lit path is kind of this joke in a way, right? Because, excuse me, what it basically means is you bang something into Google, you go to the first page that has the content, and you copy and paste it into your code. And like, I've done this. You've all done this, right? We just need to solve a problem. We're desperate to find a solution. And I feel like some of these providers are being really disingenuous because they're presenting themselves as these experts in the field, and you go to this complicated solution and go, oh, that must be the way I have to do it. And that's not really the case, right? Complexity is a bit of the enemy here. I don't know how to fight this completely, right? The modern version of this is ChatGPT giving you an answer, and that's a whole other mess too, right? You ask it how to solve a problem, and you copy that code. That's also a bad time. I think it's just something you need to keep in mind. So this comes back to Grog. And so I want you to be like Grog. Grog is a friendly Australian and maybe New Zealand mascot. I'm not really sure what the youth books are in New Zealand. I read this to my 5-year-old. It's very cute. And he solves problems in, I think the quote is something like, he has a childlike mannerism and solves things in creative ways. And if that's not how I want to build my software, I don't know what is. And so, it makes software development kind of fun and full of whimsy, rather than full of this horrible monstrosity of a diagram that, I want to be clear, like that diagram is not good for enterprise or good for some situation. It's just bad for everybody. This slide has dual purpose. If you look online, there is a great website called the Grog Brain Developer. And now that is a different type of grug, but I like the kind of analogy here. So if you look for Grog Brain Developer, there's some great advice on how to think about software really simply and not overly complicate your setup. To quote the site, one of the lines is, apex predator of Grog is complexity. And obviously, it's a lot more nuanced than that, but go have a look. So this talk is kind of interesting, and I'm a bit of the way in already, but I want the things you to take away from this is the philosophy of software. Like, why are we even in this room? And yes, it's a security conference, but let's just pretend I'm just a software engineer for now. Like, why are we even here? Why do we write software? Secondly, like the complex ways we get into knots and balls and how we write software, and just how to be better, and a few tips and tricks on what are the things you should be doing and avoiding in when you write software, especially in this kind of context of serving things on the web. But remember, I'm just some guy, right? And so, like I said before, this is the sort of talk that I wanted to hear when I was younger. And who really knows what they're doing anyway, right? The philosophy part, and I want to explain this a little bit. And it's a bit of a diatribe I have, but like what is our job, right? Our job is to take complicated concepts, ideas, systems, and turn them into magic. That's what users want to see, right? And this is not an endorsement of AI. This is not an AI magic button. But it is the idea that you do all this crazy stuff, and the end user should experience that by some really trivial experience that makes them feel enlightened and doesn't even, they shouldn't know how they shouldn't feel your blood, sweat, and tears to make that happen. But that under that secret button, you've actually encompassed a huge amount of complexity. I think one thing we forget to do as an industry for ourselves is to make that internal button in our own software. And one of the failings of that Amazon design is there was no clear abstractions, right? It was just one big glob of stuff, rather than being like, oh, I've got to silo the uploading part in one box and another part in this box. I could never zoom out and say, well, this is actually only 2 or 3 systems connected together that actually have further subparts. And this is what we're doing here, right? We're taking a lot of systems that are complicated and turning it into a simple system for our users to use. And part of the problem here is we have all these building blocks that Amazon and Google and whoever give us. I refer to these as primitives just in case I use that word interchangeably. And like I said, we can think of them holistically as serverless. They're just these tools they give you that aren't necessarily for novice or even small companies to use. They're actually really complicated primitives that are oversold, and they're pitched at a level that is not really appropriate for most of us. And frankly, this is their whole position, where they say this is anything to avoid just running a computer under your desk. And so, we've got some services you might have heard of. I think this slide doesn't necessarily work, but we've got Compute Engine, Lambda, and Dynamo, and these are things you might have heard of. So I think one interesting thing about these tools they give us is we grew up playing video games. And we're not all of us, right? But if you've been a nerd and you kind of like, trendy Zelda, whatever kind of games, or retro games, or whatever you like, Zelda's pretty modern these days. I think one thing we do, and one thing that we're probably all good at in the room, is we're good at looking at the pieces of things we have in our inventory and putting them together to solve a puzzle. I think this gives you a dopamine hit. Like, I like it. I play adventure games. I want to see, like, how do I solve this problem with the tools I have available to you? And I think the modern cloud kind of hits the dopamine in the same way. Like, we're like this. They've given us these tools, and we don't see the forest for the trees. That's all we have in our bag. And this is the thing I think I want you to take away from this talk. Like, don't fall into the trap that the only way to build software is these things that they're pushing on you they're not bad. They're just not for most people. And what if you don't have to, right? And there's an extreme opposite to this. Like, you could just run a server under your desk. And this is how the internet used to run, right? Like, I joke, but in the 90s, like, a lot of computers and services look like this. There's probably still some now at universities running like time servers or whatever random shit, right? Like, that actually is just some computer there. And there's a modern version of this, right? Like, there's a nice rack and there's a big stack of computers that are managed. This is not what you should do either. Some companies do, but it's the other extreme of, you don't just want a computer connected to the internet via a network cable and you have to worry about everything that might happen to that computer. That's also a bad time. Sorry, I realize I'm actually taking a bit longer than I should. Okay, I've been told it's fine. So if you were to go to that extreme and run your own hardware, some of the problems you have then are like, you've got this video sharing site or video editing site. You now have to worry about things like a firewall. You're on the internet. You have to worry about generating SSL certs. You've got to worry about process isolation and container management, which is, a few talks today have mentioned that. And this is the other extreme. It's the other side of the coin. I think what you can do, to bring it back to this kind of simple server design that I gave you before, is you can use a middle ground. You can say, I can run this on Amazon. I can use some of their primitives, but I haven't gone the full red pill or blue pill or whatever pill it happens to be and used all their blocks without thinking too hard about it. There was like 12 different services I had to put together was the count. And so conceptually, this should be simpler. You can also run on different providers. And that's one of the benefits of these kind of designs is that you tend to not be locked into these providers. And anecdotally, I know of some very large companies that are very locked into Amazon, and Amazon bills them so much money because they cannot leave. This is a different, yet again, that's not a problem the audience should have. And frankly, it's a fun story, but like this is not, but that's part of the problem, right? We think about these things at the scale of most of our end users, and it's just the wrong kind of scale to ponder. However, if you are at one of those companies, please hit me up. I can help you fix your problems. So with that all kind of set up, that's kind of the intro to the talk and the kind of complexity angle. I do want to run through a few of kind of patterns that I think are really important to take away. And this is some advice that I want to give you that is the things that you should, it's kind of like do's or don'ts. And I have text here. I feel bad I haven't fixed all the text on my slides. But I think one thing to remember is when you're building cloud whatever services using whatever primitives, the things you should avoid. I think one thing you should avoid doing is if you find yourself generating SSL certs or worrying about IP addresses or even handling DDoS attacks, maybe find a primitive or a tool that helps you mitigate those things. This is something there's only really one right way to do. And so like if you're using, it's cool that we have Let's Encrypt that just generates the certificates, but like you can find a cloud provider that just does that for you, and that's kind of nice, right? There's only one way to do it, so why bother doing it yourself? One thing you should do is just serve HTTP. The web is built on HTTP. Like, it's a protocol, and you might find that your provider or whatever tool you're using tries to abstract that away behind some weird kind of a way of calling you. And we can use HTTP. That's the primitive we have. Yes, it gets enhanced by SSL and whatever else, but don't do anything weird that doesn't look like that, because that also makes you not interoperable with different providers. Do get things talking to each other. This is an interesting point. A lot of what cloud providers do is, I've got a runtime server that runs the HTTP server, I've got a database server, I've got some other server. A lot of what it does is just try to put them in a room together. And I think once you realize that's what those providers are doing for you, you can think of that problem a bit differently. There's a great blog post by a company called Tailscale. And Tailscale is a kind of interesting type of VPC or VPN that puts services in the same LAN. And the blog is really interesting because it talks about the fact that a lot of what these providers are doing is just getting stuff to talk to each other. And it sounds mundane, but like we deal with certificates and keys and all this shit. And if we just had a way for all these computers to be on the same LAN to talk unencrypted, but actually under the hood, it's secure, tunneled, whatever, your life would be easier. Your database server doesn't need a login anymore because you just use it. It's just there conceptually next to you. Do prevent unauthorized access. I mean, OAuth and JWTs are the standard. Don't try to reinvent the wheel on that front. This is a very short slide. And I think the last point here is don't over-engineer solutions for scale. One thing I hear a lot about the cloud providers is like, oh, use this stuff. It'll scale to infinite usage. But actually, it just scales your bills, right? And an interesting thing here is like, you can solve scalable, if you have a lot of users for your video compression site, that's a good problem to have. And I think there's a lot of low-tech solutions that you can use to mitigate risk or whatever else. This is kind of a different end of the scale. Like, this is, you've made a successful startup, what next, right? How do you deal with that now? But I think there's very low-tech solutions that, you think of your site going down for a few hours, you can build up something pretty fast that solves that problem. Lastly, one last thing I want to say is that we have unknown unknowns, right? It's all well and good to write software, but bringing back to security, we're at a security conference. It's all well and good to say, oh, Sam, you should write some simple software that's really good, but what about all the security features Amazon gives us, right? Now, I would posit that actually having a simpler bit of software makes it easier to understand your vulnerabilities. If you have 12, 13 different pieces of software that the way they interact, that are the way that people can talk to your system, then actually you've got more surface area to worry about. And so I think if you have fewer pieces, it's easier to understand where your attacks are coming from. I want to mention IAM very, very briefly, because it was in the talk slide. I was told many times I could change my title, but I want to mention it. IAM is interesting because it's a thing. This is a bit of a side note. I want you to consider it this way. When you have lots of things, you have lots of roles. And that's one of the things that these serverless primitives require you to have. So everything runs as a different permission access model. And I think to me, this is the pointy end of using all those building blocks, is you have to deal with the ramifications of that. And so, yet again, in my consulting world, I've experienced some situations where people have run out of IAM roles in their Amazon account. Now, that's a weird thing and won't make sense to a lot of people, but for people who know, that's totally bonkers, right? That should never actually happen. They've just got too many things, and it represents the pointy end of that complexity. So I'm nearly done. I've been Sam. You can find me online. I do some writing about some stuff and rant about things. If your company only takes advice that they pay for, you can pay me to say the same things I've just told you. This is not an uncommon practice, right? You can go back and go, I've heard this great guy. He's really interesting. But like, oh, can we pay him? Oh, yeah, OK, great, OK. No warranty implied. But the thing I want to give you, the real thing I want to leave you with is don't just follow blindly these patterns you see online. This is the thing I wish I had given myself a long time ago. When I was at Google for a long time, when I left Google, I was like, I should study all the Amazon primitives and all the things to know how to get a job in the real world. And I did. And then I knew, then all the outcome was I had a rote knowledge of all these tools. I didn't really know why I used them or how they fit in context. I just knew, I knew there was Dynamo, I knew there was SNS, I knew there was Bigtable, I knew those things. And I crammed it like I was cramming for a HSC exam. I didn't think about it in context and big picture stuff. And so the thing for you is, wherever you work, wherever you go, question why they've made these choices, right? Have they just followed the best practice without really thinking about why? So that's it. Thank you.